Welcome everyone to the Center for Advanced Research and Innovation. Here at Charisma University, we are proud to present original research in various fields. The committee members are Dr. Wallert, Dr. Jimerson, Dr. Chukwuka, Dr. Butera, and I am Dr. Dean, and this is Dr. Wade.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to ask you, since we are recording, if you will turn off your microphones. And I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Travis Handfield. And we're very proud of Dr. Handfield. He has just offended, and he is a new doctor. Sounds like you're a newborn, but you are a new doctor. And as Dr. Christy Dean and I were very excited and very thankful to be his chairs for his dissertation, we felt like this would be an advantage for you guys to hear what he has to say. So I'm going to turn it over to our new expert in aviation for TCI.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ann, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining wherever you are located in the world. So my research was focused on the COVID-19 pandemic and provided a qualitative impact analysis of the TCI aviation and tourism industry. Just a little bit about myself. I am Travis Handfield, now Dr. Travis Handfield. I'm the oldest of 7 siblings, and you can just imagine that a lot of people are looking to me to be a model of success. So this research is the culmination of my time at Charisma University, exploring what I do on a day-to-day basis, which is working within the aviation industry and, by extension, the tourism industry here in Turks and Caicos. And if you know anything about the Turks and Caicos, you know that we are beautiful, pristine. We have some of the best beaches in the world, always winning world-class awards. So it is no surprise that everything that we do day in, day out revolves around tourism in some form or the other. So my research is combining what I do on a day-to-day basis, which is working in aviation and looking at tourism, and how the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a surprise to all of us, has played a role in how we chart a way forward going into a post-COVID era. So my research is very timely in the fact that it can provide some talking points for interested stakeholders wanting to find out what the COVID-19 pandemic has done within the Turks and Caicos in terms of its economy, its people, the well-being of its people, and how it can rebound and position itself for, in case there are future disasters of this nature, how do we best prepare for it? So just a little bit about my home. We are located some 600 miles away from Miami, Florida. That's off the coast of the United States. We are just above the island of Hispaniola, which is home to Haiti and Dominican Republic, and just southeast of the Bahamas. Now, if you think you've never heard of such small islands dotted in the Caribbean, you might be safe to say that's the general impression that not many people know about us. But just a little bit of how we've played a role in world history. The Turks and Caicos Islands in both world wars, because we're British overseas territory, a lot of our natural resources were used during the World War by the UK to aid in its war efforts. In the space race, John Glenn, after he orbited the Earth, he splashed down a few miles off our capital, which is Grand Turk, and we have a replica of the Friendship spaceship here in the country. So even though we're a small country in terms of population and in terms of size, we have played our role in world history. And we're even rumored to be the location for Columbus's landfall in 1492, although it's disputed by very few other Caribbean countries, but we think we have the strongest case for that. So even though we're small, we play a significant role in world history, and we are the hotspot right now, even more so since COVID-19 has come about, real hotspot where everyone who's got wealth, anyone who's got the resources to do so, they find themselves here in Turks and Caicos because of our pristine beauty, and because not many people care so much about, the celebrity lifestyle, so people can come, relax, and be at one with nature, and not be so bothered about, paparazzi and all the likes from their original points of home. So it was very interesting to look at this research from the perspective of the residents, persons who live in the Turks and Caicos and call this place home. So we live here, but people come here to vacation. So it's only fitting that we, as a population, understand what it means to live in a tourism-dependent country, and how the COVID-19 pandemic has played a role in how we recover and get out of it. So my research, like I said, is very timely. So I hope that you all will enjoy the presentation, and at the end of it, you can ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So the relevance of my research. We are, as the Turks and Caicos Islands, focus around tourism. We cannot deny it. Everything that we do is all about tourism, and it's all down to our natural beauty. And if you know anything about the Caribbean, the countries in the Caribbean are prone to natural disasters. More than anything else, you would have heard about hurricanes. So the most recent hurricane to have an impact on the Turks and Caicos occurred in 2017, where Ike and Hannah were the names of those, it was Irma and Maria. And both hurricanes were major hurricanes, and they passed through the Turks and Caicos within this time frame of a week of each other. So the diagram that I have up on the screen now shows the Turks and Caicos about a month before the storms of 2017, September 2017 to be exact. And the image that I'm going to pull up now shows the immediate effect on our natural environment following those storms. So you can see on the left-hand side how we're all nicely shaped in a horseshoe. Everything is all packed together, nice and neat. But Mother Nature had other plans. So in the space of a week of those storms, you can see how our national banks and our national beauty has been scattered and is not as uniform and as polished as you would expect it to be without any natural disasters, namely hurricanes. So it's prudent for persons like myself who live in the Turks and Caicos to look at how we can protect our natural environment, not just from natural disasters, but from over-tourism, and how we can look at other means of actually having a thriving economy that is not 100% driven by tourism figures. Unfortunately, it is no surprise that most of the persons who visit Turks and Caicos arrive by air. The cruise ship industry plays a small role, but for the purposes of my research, I excluded that aspect of the tourism industry. So just focus on the main mode of transport, which was air travel. So the COVID-19 pandemic, for most of us, we're still living in what it means to be in a COVID environment. We still have some of the COVID restrictions and some of the policies that were implemented as a result of COVID-19. So my initial rough research looked at, okay, COVID-19 is impacting us tremendously because we concentrate our economic activities around tourism. And either indirectly or directly, everyone that lives in Turks and Caicos has some involvement within the tourism service sector and in the product sector. And my research question wanted to look at this COVID-19 pandemic. What is it, and what does it mean to Turks and Caicos? And how does it compare to what we're used to? And when I say used to, on a yearly basis, we prepare and we allocate resources for hurricanes. But the COVID-19 was a surprise. It was an unplanned disaster. So in the immediate term, resources had to be allocated from somewhere to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was in my head, I start thinking about, okay, how does the COVID-19 pandemic stack up to other disasters that the Turks and Caicos and possibly the region had to deal with? And these are the three research questions that I came up with. How many days and months does it take the economy to recover, just on a whole? And after disaster, what is the immediate priorities? What is necessary to at least start the recovery effort straight away? And since most of the persons who arrive in the Turks and Caicos Islands with their international remittances with them, that actually feeds into the treasury of the Turks and Caicos, how does the aviation industry play a role in that recovery effort? And possibly in relation to COVID-19, were there any special consideration, seeing that COVID-19 impacted that aspect of the tourism sector so severely? So my research questions, they seem to be one and the same, but it looks at the issue in a slightly different perspective, so that in essence, I'm looking at the tourism industry, I'm looking at the aviation industry, which feeds into the tourism industry here in Turks and Caicos. And what does that mean going forward? What does that mean in terms of the day-to-day citizen who live in Turks and Caicos? How does the aviation industry impact the overall tourism industry and product that the Turks and Caicos is known for? So if we looked at some of the historical instances that TCI had to deal with, as I mentioned at the beginning, the most recent would have been the hurricanes of 2017. But there is a study that was done by the World Travel Council. Between the periods of 2001 and 2018, there was 90 documented cases of crisis that the region as a whole had to deal with. And of those 90 cases, there was about 32% related to terrorism and security. 36% of those 90 cases was natural disaster related. 19% was political instability. These are crises that affected the region. And 13% was disease and outbreaks. Now, if I was to put myself into the picture here, I know that I was home at the time when the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 occurred. So I witnessed that firsthand. But other disasters such as the disease outbreak, which account for 13%, it was SARS, the bird flu, Ebola, Zika virus, and included in that was chikungunya and MARS. These are some of the disasters, crises that the region had to deal with. And seeing that it only occurred in 13% of the 90 cases between 2001 and 2018, you can almost assume that the region is not normally prepared to deal with these sorts of outbreaks when it comes to natural disasters, because it's almost guaranteed it will occur. Governments within the Caribbean region would allocate resources to deal with these. But unfortunately, disease and outbreaks, it's unplanned. You don't normally expect it to happen, so resources aren't allocated for this on a yearly basis. So the Turks and Caicos, and by extension, the region as a whole, was unprepared to deal with that fallout from COVID-19. So it was interesting to look at what it means to live in Turks and Caicos in the midst of COVID-19, not knowing what's going to happen, because the country had to close down for 4 months to at least allow the government to put measures in place to curb the spread of the virus. And it meant anyone else who was out had to stay out, and those who were in had to remain. So those of us who live in Turks and Caicos, we don't have the resources to keep our own economy afloat. And that's one of the findings that I will come to in my research. So everything came to a standstill. Everyone looked to the government to provide some sort of support or assistance to at least allow the economy to have some sort of economic movement through the 4 months until the government then saw that it was fitting to reopen to international travelers. So there was a gap in the literature in relation to Turks and Caicos. Yes, we are an overseas territory of the UK. Yes, we are geographically located in the Atlantic, but we are politically and culturally part of the Caribbean region. Now, normally speaking, the region as a whole is looked at the bigger countries within the Caribbean. Turks and Caicos is often overlooked because of our small size in population and maybe because of our small economic contribution to the overall picture of the Caribbean. So there wasn't much literature review available that speaks directly to Turks and Caicos on any matter. So my research is filling a little bit of that void in providing some information that is specific to Turks and Caicos and specific to COVID-19 and specific to the tourism and aviation industry of the Caribbean as a whole. And there were some contribution to the field of business administration in that my research is concerning economic activity, what it means to run a company or run a country that is purely driven by tourism numbers, and understanding what it means to have continuity plan and operate a business within the Caribbean, and recovery strategy, economic recovery strategies. One of the terms that I came across in my initial literature review was disaster economics, which is an up-and-coming field within the business aviation spectrum. So it's looking at disasters and the economic fallout and recovery aspects of that, and providing information to governments and other stakeholders in the Caribbean about future-proofing their economy to deal with natural disasters and now unplanned disasters. As I've said previously, in the past report between 2001 and 2018, only 13% of the crisis the region faced was related to outbreaks and diseases. So that means that there should be more emphasis placed on having continuity plan that speaks specifically to these types of crises. And COVID-19 is a perfect example of that. My research, because of how I started off just casually speaking to people about how the COVID-19 was impacting them, it felt natural to use a qualitative research methodology. I wanted to get people's personal perspective and stories to share. I wanted to get a deeper understanding of what the COVID-19 pandemic was doing and what impact it was having on the citizens, the persons who live here in Turks and Caicos. And combined with that was an interpretive paradigm, which goes hand in hand with qualitative research, because I wanted to speak to people one-on-one and in focus group to gauge their perspective, to then provide an opportunity for me to reflect on the responses provided, and then possibly, if needs be, go back through my research questions to see whether or not the answers that I'm being fed actually provide a response to what I'm trying to uncover. And I think based on what I've already accomplished, I was very pleased with actually taking this methodology, using it, and seeing it worked. And it was so inspiring to get some of the stories that fed into my research. Obviously, literature review played a part in terms of understanding what impact tourism has in the Caribbean, whereas in some countries, more than 60% up to 80% of the country's GDP is all tourism related. So the literature review provide that foundation to see the significance of tourism within the Caribbean. The Turks and Caicos, for example, sometimes in the government's report, there's about an 80% contribution of tourism to the overall GDP. So the literature review set up the stage to understand the tourism impact and the aviation impact as well. So both industries combined has a considerable contribution towards the overall economic activities within the Caribbean. I know the same can be said for other locations, but like I said in the beginning, I am just focusing on the Caribbean because that's where I'm based. I'm passionate about where I live, where I grew up, and where I work. So it's no surprise that the one-on-one interviews and the focus group provided that rich data that I needed. I was then able to look at a pilot study, which then gave me an understanding of how do I shape the research question to get more targeted responses to each of the individual research questions, and then at the end, just marry them all together to provide a continuous flow from one research question to the next. So a pilot study was conducted where all of the research questions were analyzed to make sure it was clear and it was actually feeding back information that was useful and relevant to my study. So some of the key findings of the research. I'm not going to speak to the research questions individually, but I'm just going to look at it holistically. In regards to aviation in Turks and Caicos, there's two segments of that industry. There's commercial aviation and general aviation. Commercial aviation looks at the likes of American Airlines, JetBlue, Southwest, Air Canada. And general aviation is everyone else. So that's all the private plane, that's the military aircraft, that's anyone who's got a private plane that's not related to American Airlines or JetBlue or Delta is considered general aviation. So one of the interesting aspects of the aviation industry here in Turks and Caicos is that when there's a disaster and everything shuts down, closed down, whatever you want to call it, immediately after the all clear is given by the government, it is the general aviation that really kickstarts everything. It's the segment that mobilizes the recovery for Turks and Caicos. And the research indicated to me that general aviation is able to do that because it's mostly privately owned aircraft. It's not tied to any particular airline or any group of airlines. There's less red tape. It's just a matter of if the airport is open, you have the resources to do so, and you have permission from the government, you can operate. So after a disaster, be it natural, unplanned, or whatever the case may be, general aviation kickstarts everything. Be it PPE coming in, whether or not it's medical personnel coming in. In the case of COVID-19, even though the country was closed for 4 months, general aviation was still allowed to come in because persons had to be sent out of the country because some medical expertise was not available in country. Vaccines were brought in. There was a contingent of Cuban medical doctors and nurses who were brought in from Cuba to help the Turks and Caicos with on-the-ground support. It was all general aviation. Commercial aviation was completely non-existent. And this was not just unique here to Turks and Caicos and unique to COVID-19. Whenever there's a disaster, one of the first aspects of recovery, because we're UK overseas territory, is that the RAF, the Royal Air Force, will come in. They will come in with additional support to help in whatever capacity that the TCI requires. Commercial, on the other hand, takes much longer because obviously there's more stakeholders involved. The commercial airliners need to be sure that the Turks and Caicos is still an in-demand location that warrants them coming back into the destination. And until there's enough support and interest in the destination, the commercial carriers will not return to Turks and Caicos. And obviously that can be an issue when, you know, the Turks and Caicos needs that incoming traveler to come with their disposable income to spend in the economy to actually get things flowing again. So it is very surprising, not to me as so much so as a researcher, but to persons who I spoke to when they start piecing together what really happens after disaster. They are able to marry that recovery effort really starts with the general aviation sector. Tourism doesn't really happen until the aviation industry is able to mobilize and reopen and allow persons and air carriers to come back into Turks and Caicos. So COVID-19 versus other natural disasters, the recovery itself for COVID-19 most of the respondents made the linkage in that COVID-19 reflects what happened to the TCI during the financial crisis of 2008 to 2019. Sorry, 2008, 2009, in that there was no infrastructural damage within Turks and Caicos. In the case of a hurricane, if a hurricane passed through Turks and Caicos, infrastructure is damaged. So until that is rebuilt, nothing can happen. The TCI is closed for business. But the COVID-19, unlike other disasters, there's no infrastructural damage. It was just financial. It's all economic. It was health related. So it was more intangible. So people weren't really seeing the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, except for the fact that no one is actually coming into the country and they were unemployed, not having disposable income. But unlike other natural disasters, in particular for Turks and Caicos, COVID-19 brought with it death. Now, if we trace back about 20 years for Turks and Caicos, the maximum number of persons who have died as a result of a hurricane passage through the country is probably 5. At the time of my reporting, there were 39 registered deaths, COVID-related deaths within Turks and Caicos. And for a small population of about less than 50,000 people, that is significant. Now, compared to the rest of the Caribbean, our death rate was very, very low. But if it's something that we're never experienced on this magnitude before, it was devastating. There was a lot more persons impacted by those 39 deaths than ever before in Turks and Caicos history. So that was one of the key differences between COVID-19 versus other natural disasters that happened in the past few years. So some of the challenges to recovery that I highlighted in my report, and the only one I'm going to stress today, is access to finance. The Turks and Caicos Constitution was suspended in 2008 and reinstated in 2012. And the UK stipulated that successive governments must have better governance over the Treasury. And it came with more checks and balances and more oversight by the UK. But it has proven to be very beneficial to the Turks and Caicos. And I say that because the Turks and Caicos has a very healthy cash surplus, very healthy cash reserve. The Turks and Caicos is not running a deficit. The Turks and Caicos doesn't have any debts whatsoever. Now, that was significant for Turks and Caicos because even though the country was closed to international arrivals, the government still had the resources, the liquid resources, to somewhat stimulate the economy. So persons got grants and stimulus checks from the government. The government then provided vaccines free of charge to everyone in the country. So these are some of the challenges where it might be a challenge to other persons and other countries in the Caribbean, but the TCI did not have an issue with access to finance. Now, prior to 2008, the finances of the country was in shambles. Without a doubt, it was in shambles. So the Constitution was suspended. And we had a major hurricane, 2 major hurricanes in 2007, Ike and Hannah. Again, both hurricanes occurred within a week. So on the heels of 2 major hurricanes and the finances of the country being in shambles, the recovery took much longer, much longer. And most respondents believe that even to this day, there are still some persons in Turks and Caicos who are still recovering from those storms of 2007. And then we have another 2 major hurricanes in 2017, and then COVID-19 came about. So the country might have recovered infrastructurally from all of these disasters, but there are still some persons on the ground who are still feeling the effects of storms going back to 2007. For example, there are some houses that still have temporary roofs on them. But on the whole, the Turks and Caicos is booming, it's flourishing, but on the ground, there are still some persons who are hurting, and access to finance can be a challenge. in the case of COVID-19, thankfully, the country had liquid resources to at least provide some sort of relief to the persons who are stuck, for lack of a better word, in the country while it's on lockdown. So there is some element of a domestic economy that sprung up in those 4 months. So we saw lots of new entrepreneurs who came on stream as a result of COVID-19. Persons started cooking and selling, and those persons who had like water sports, obviously they did not have the tourist numbers as you would expect, but they were discounting these services just for the sake of not allowing their business to completely close. And those stimulus checks that the government was able to give to the residents actually helped move some sort of economic activity around the entire Turks and Caicos. It wasn't to the same level as if things were in normal operating time, but it was something that was obvious, and the respondents did make it very clear that this is something the government needs to look into, how to actually develop a domestic economy within Turks and Caicos, so that if something like COVID-19 do occur in the future, everything doesn't come to a complete standstill. There could be some semblance of economic activity keeping things afloat until such a time that the country is able to rebound from whatever disaster it is going through. So there's an additional appreciation for the Teesside natural environment. The country is closed for 4 months. There's less demand on Mother Nature. The country was able to breathe. The air was crisper. The beaches, well, they were more accessible to the locals who live here. It was less strain on the environment. So again, respondents then realized that, there's a lot of demand on our natural resources, and it's quite limited. So we need to be cognizant of how do we actually develop a tourism product that is sustainable now and into the future? How do we actually develop a further appreciation for our environment as a whole? Because, for example, some types of permitted development. There's some locations that we should never develop because it should be considered nature reserve. So it opened up this research opened up the conversation with potential stakeholders about how do we allocate resources and manage our resource planning procedure much more efficient and better to ensure that if there's an economic fallout again, how can the TCI be able to sustain itself? So some of the challenges I had to encounter with this research, as I said at the beginning, there is very limited research conducted that is targeted on Turks and Caicos. Local resources is quite limited. Unfortunately, I did send my request to participate in this research to about 36 people. Only 23 actually agreed to be a part of the research, making my response rate about 64%. Unfortunately, we've had fires in the past few years that burnt down 2 of our National Archive buildings. So access to information, which is on another island, can be very limited. There isn't much scholarly research that is located within Turks and Caicos. So this research will add to that body of knowledge here within the Turks and Caicos space. And it's important to know that there is a local community college. Obviously, Charisma is located here as well. So it's now allowing me to look at opportunities to partner with the university and the community college to possibly collect or collate information that can be beneficial to other persons wanting to conduct research in Turks and Caicos on whatever field it might be. So it's interesting to look at challenges and then look at the possible opportunity out of those challenges. So I hope that my research can have the conversation, be a catalyst for pulling together resources in Turks and Caicos that is accessible to persons in Turks and Caicos and out who wants to do and undertake research. because obviously Turks and Caicos is a fascinating country, and it is a shame that we don't have, the wealth of information that's readily available to anyone who wants to conduct research. So I am very proud that my research will fill in a little bit of that void, that knowledge void, and possibly someone might reference it in something else that's connected to aviation and tourism if they do decide to pursue study here at Charisma University. So going forward, my research is looking at tourism, the future of tourism, economic activity, and these are the key stakeholders. Yes, the citizens makes up part of it as well, but the decision makers are obviously the Turks and Caicos government, the tourist board, the airport authority, which is in charge of all the airports in the country. So looking at the research, these are the persons who will play a role in determining the future of Turks and Caicos and what the tourism product of the Turks and Caicos looks like going forward. And obviously, again, the Department of Environment should be interested in resource planning of what available resources we've got. And obviously, the government cannot do everything themselves, so there should be an emphasis on public and private partnership to get things rolling. And as a private citizen, I wish I could be involved in that conversation. And I hope now that I've earned my degree and have my research to hand, that I can be part of the conversation to spearhead some of the thought processes going forward. And one of the topics that is included in future studies that I thought will be very beneficial, obviously I'm not going to do it as yet, but COVID-19 brought a unique challenge to the Caribbean. The Caribbean is known for its hospitality. The Caribbean is known for its food, its cuisine, its music. But when COVID-19 came about, everyone had to wear masks, everyone had to wear face covering, everyone had to social distance. So the level of interaction between residents and guests was very, very limited. So I wanted to find out, as part of future research, what is people's perception of Caribbean hospitality as a result of COVID-19? They're not getting the same experience that they would have had pre-COVID. And now we're living in the almost post-COVID era. How has the Caribbean hospitality changed as a result of COVID-19? Because there's still persons who are hesitant to engage with persons as they would have in the past. So I think that's one of the most fascinating topics that I've suggested in my research for future study. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not it's one that someone takes up. So in conclusion, the research process was absolutely fascinating. I enjoy sitting down and speaking to persons, hearing their stories, and then putting it together and seeing how it tied into what someone else has said. So the qualitative research method allowed me to find those common themes throughout both the interview and focus groups, and paint a picture that presented the Turks and Caicos in a unique light. How does its tourism mechanism actually work, and how does the aviation segment of that plays a role in shaping the future of tourism and economic activity here in Turks and Caicos? And because I work in the aviation industry, I will continue to be fascinated by the industry itself, and looking at what it means to live in Turks and Caicos, have an over-reliance on tourism, and can it be future-proof to at least cushion the fallout, the economic fallout from any future planned and unplanned disasters. I hope that there will be lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, which some of the respondents indicated were learned lessons from the 2008 global financial crisis. So going forward, there is many opportunities to explore within this unique field here in Turks and Caicos. And it's without a doubt that going forward, you will see and you will hear of new topics, new ideas, new initiatives that is geared towards the aviation industry, and looking at those tourism dependent countries and how they chart their way forward. Because yes, cruise industry makes up a very small percentage of it, but we have to deal with what the realities are now for these locations and what their future can potentially be. So at this time, I want to thank you for listening to the highlights of my research, and I hope that you might have some questions to feed to me that I can possibly share some more with you. So thank you.
Well, this is Dr. Butera. And first, I have to say congratulations, doctor.
Thank
From
you.
another newer doctor. Mine's only about 3 years old. So that first feeling and the first time that you're called doctor in the first year are going to make your face light up. And then it'll probably still keep lighting up after that. So congratulations on your hard work and your well-earned new title.
Thank you very much.
Have a question. You're very welcome. This has been probably on this type of topic, very real, very easy to understand for somebody who's not in the tourism or the aviation industry, because I'm not. But how much of what you've learned about the mitigation potential for Turks and Caicos is going to be able to be applied to other island tourism places, like Puerto Rico, for example? You know, they had their hurricane that they still have not recovered from, and then another one, and then COVID on top of that. So how much of your research is going to end up being applicable for other smaller nations or states or regions that are island-based tourism spots globally?
Thank you very much for your question. I did address some of that in my research. Unfortunately, in the case of Puerto Rico, I cannot say that Turks and Caicos, the findings I found for Turks and Caicos can apply directly to Puerto Rico, because we are an overseas territory of the UK. Puerto Rico is tied back to the US. So for us, we have to work extra hard to get tourists to come to us. Puerto Rico gets its tourism numbers from the mainland. That's domestic travel. So it's interesting that the priority for domestic market might not be the same as an international perspective, because everyone that comes into Turks and Caicos are all international travelers. Even a person from the UK, they are considered international travelers. So someone traveled from the UK to Turks and Caicos, that's not domestic travel, that's international. So we get more revenue per person that comes into our country versus Puerto Rico. I visited Puerto Rico this year, actually, and I had visited prior to the storms. So I have seen the work that they have done themselves to have some sort of tourism recovery strategy in place. So there's some lessons to be learned from Turks and Caicos, but I think about the political red tape that Puerto Rico has to go through is not the same for Turks and Caicos. We are self-governing, self-autonomous. We are just a UK overseas territory. So we more or less guide our future. We're not relying on aid from the Turks and Caicos. From the UK, we have to earn that revenue ourselves, which then feeds into what we do as recovery strategies. Whereas the Puerto Rico can tap into federal aid and other government assistance from the mainland, they can draw on that. So their recovery is not as, I don't want to use
robust.
The word, robust as ours. It wouldn't.
I'm being kind. I'm being kind.
But we have to start.
Yes, I'm in the United States, and yes, I'm in the United States, and I was fortunate enough to visit Puerto Rico many, many years ago in the 90s, actually. The late 90s is when I was there, and it was for a conference for a week, and Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful island. And the pictures that I saw after the devastation of the hurricanes, and, and years later, there are still people in some of the mountains without
That's
power.
right. That's
You
right.
know, it's
Heartbreaking.
very disheartening. It's very disheartening. But you made an interesting point that I really wasn't aware of when you had said that, I mean, yes, the travel would be domestic for, Americans that are going there, and for Turks and Caicos, even though you're a territory, that you're self-governed, and, you kind of do your own thing in
That's
Turks
right.
and Caicos. And that's something that I honestly was not aware of. So that's a great point. And that's a very interesting point, because a lot of that, um, policy and procedures and so forth, and any
Mhm.
mitigation plans for the future are definitely going to be more robust in a self-governed island territory than it would
Yes.
be in one that's actually a territory of a mainland,
Mhm.
as you expressed. So very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question.
Do we have other questions?
Um, yes, I have a question. I know, Dr. Travis, you were looking at Turks and Caicos specifically, but if you were to conduct this research looking at another Caribbean or tourism dependent nation, how might your findings change or be different from those found in TCF?
Thank you very much for your question. Piggy, to piggyback on the question that was asked previously, my research is very geared towards British overseas territories. So there are 14 overseas territories of UK that still exist um, today, but the ones that are here in the Caribbean are Anguilla, Bermuda, Cayman Island, Montserrat, Turks and Caicos, and the British Virgin Islands. So even though these countries are UK overseas dependent territories, all of them are still self-governing. They set their own destiny, for lack of a better word. But the unique perspective on, let's say, Cayman Islands, for example, is that their economic makeup is not the same as Turks and Caicos. Cayman Islands is more or less a financial center. They were closed for months. Months. I think they were closed for at least 18 months. Turks and Caicos could not afford to do that. We could not. So our economy is purely driven by tourism. More than 85 to 90% of our economic activity comes from tourism. But in the case of Cayman Islands, which is also British overseas territory, their economic makeup is mostly financial services. So they were able to keep the economy closed to international travelers for a much longer time.
Mhm.
So it is interesting to highlight between the dependent territories, we're not all the same.
Mm.
But if you have a high reliance on tourism, then yes, my research can be generalized to another British overseas dependent territory. And I would say the next closest example to us would be the British Virgin Islands, because they have the same economic makeup as us, the same population density as us, and the same size of the territory geographically as Turks and Caicos. But Cayman Islands, for example, is in a completely different feel to us.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
And Dr. Travis, I have one. When you think of economic development, I always kind of think about quantitative studies,
Mhm.
and I really like that yours was qualitative. Can you tell me why you wanted to go in that vein? You said a little bit about it in what you were talking about, but earlier. But can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
I can. One of the issues I found starting this research was that there was no data. There was no data to glean from. The literature review solidified my decision to go with a qualitative research methodology because I was struggling to find data that I can say, okay, empirically, this is that, this is that. And when it has to do with something novel like the coronavirus, I want to take a humanitarian approach to it. I want to take a humanistic approach to it. How is the person who's living in Turks and Caicos day in, day out dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic? Because the numbers, the facts, and the charts is all good and pretty, but what does that mean for someone like me who have to get up every morning and go to work in a post-COVID era? What does that mean? Yes, you can say, economic activity is at least 50% over and above this year, but am I feeling that? Has my pocket increased by that 50%? So it is very interesting to actually sit down and talk to people without them having to be experts in their fields to understand, okay, you're living in Turks and Caicos, we've been closed down for 4 months, how did that impact you? And then possibly, if someone does do a qualitative and a quantitative research, compare the two and see whether or not there is some correlation, whether or not what persons have said in my research match and paints a picture or a story to the numbers and the facts and the charts. So for me, I wanted to share people's perspective. I like to talk to people, so just putting it simply, I wanted to hear their story, their opinion. It was more fascinating than just looking at boring numbers.
Said from an accountant standpoint, I love it. Excellent. Thank you. I love that.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have any questions for Dr. Travis? All right, Dr. Dean, I'll turn it over to you. Unmute. Dr. Dane, unmute.
All right. On
Okay.
behalf of Charisma University and the Carey team, Dr. Wallert and Dr. Butera, who was in attendance, we would like to thank you for attending. Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Travis.
you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.